January 17, 1943. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Inside Standard Oil's refinery, engineers stared at steel towers groaning under pressure. The smell of sulfur filled the air. Across the ocean, American tanks sat silent, out of fuel. In the Pacific, landing craft waited in harbors, unable to move. The Pentagon was terrified. America, the world's largest oil producer, was running out of diesel. Without it, the invasion of Europe would fail. The war could be lost. But in this Louisiana refinery, a handful of chemists were attempting the impossible, cracking crude oil's waste into fuel. If they failed, soldiers would die. If they succeeded, they would change the war forever. This is the story of how America almost lost World War II, because of a fuel no one thought they could make. January 17, 1943. The winter air hung thick over the sprawling industrial complex in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Inside the cavernous halls of Standard Oil's newest refinery, engineers in grease-stained overalls stood before towering steel columns that groaned and hissed with the sound of pressurized heat. The acrid smell of sulfur and petroleum filled the air, mingling with the metallic taste of anxiety. Outside, the Mississippi River flowed dark and silent, indifferent to the crisis unfolding within these walls. Across the ocean, American soldiers were freezing in North Africa, their diesel-powered tanks and trucks running dangerously low on fuel. In the Pacific, landing craft sat idle in harbor shipyards, waiting for the diesel that would carry Marines across bloody beaches. And here, in this industrial cathedral of American ingenuity, a handful of men stood on the precipice of either national salvation or catastrophic failure. The numbers were unforgiving. The war machine needed diesel. And America, for all its industrial might, for all its assembly lines and factory floors, did not have enough. This was not supposed to happen. Not to America. Not to the nation that had electrified the world, that had put automobiles on every street, that had built the Panama Canal and the Empire State Building. Yet in the third winter of World War II, the United States faced a fuel crisis so severe that military planners in Washington spoke in hushed tones about rationing operations, delaying invasions, perhaps even negotiating a conditional peace in one theater to concentrate resources in another. The Axis powers, had they known the depth of this shortage, would have rejoiced. But they did not know. Because even as the deficit grew, even as the Pentagon calculated how many tanks could not be fueled and how many transport ships would remain docked, American engineers were racing against time itself to solve a problem that threatened to undermine the entire Allied war effort. Diesel fuel. It seems so mundane now, so ordinary. A commodity pumped into trucks at every filling station, taken for granted as the lifeblood of commerce and transportation. But in 1943, diesel was not ordinary. It was strategic. It was survival. And America was running out. To understand how the world's largest oil producer could face such a crisis, one must understand what diesel fuel actually is, and, more critically, what it was not in 1943. Crude oil, as it emerges from the earth, is not fuel. It is a complex mixture of hydrocarbons, a molecular soup ranging from light gases to heavy, tar-like bitumen. Refineries exist to separate and transform this soup into usable products. Through a process called fractional distillation, crude oil is heated until it vaporizes, then cooled in stages. The lightest molecules, gasoline, condense at lower temperatures near the top of the distillation column. The heavier molecules, diesel and fuel oil, condense lower down, at higher temperatures. Heavier still are residual oils and asphalt. Before the war, this process worked well enough. American refineries produced gasoline for the nation's automobiles, kerosene for lamps, and some diesel for locomotives and ships. But the proportions were all wrong for war. Crude oil, when distilled naturally, yields perhaps 20% diesel fuel and 40% gasoline. The American military in 1943 needed the opposite ratio. Diesel powered the Liberty ships that carried supplies across the Atlantic. Diesel drove the landing craft that would storm Fortress Europe. Diesel fueled the tanks, the half-tracks, the mobile artillery, the trucks that formed the logistical backbone of mechanized warfare. And diesel, unlike gasoline, could not simply be wished into existence. The Allies had gambled their entire strategy on mobility. The German Blitzkrieg had taught the world that modern war was about speed, about armored columns punching through defensive lines, about air support, and rapid encirclement. The British and Americans had studied these lessons well. Their doctrine called for overwhelming material superiority, for fleets of tanks and aircraft that would crush Axis resistance through sheer abundance. But abundance requires fuel, and by early 1943, the calculations were becoming nightmarish. The War Production Board estimated that America would need to triple its diesel output by 1944 to meet projected military demands. Yet traditional distillation methods had reached their physical limits. You could not squeeze more diesel from crude oil than nature had put there. The chemistry was immutable, or so it seemed. In retrospect, the shortage should have been predictable. But wars rarely unfold according to plan, and the American mobilization had been improvised at a scale never before attempted in human history. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States possessed only a fraction of the military infrastructure it would need. Shipyards that had built a handful of merchant vessels per year were suddenly tasked with launching one every day. Aircraft factories that produced dozens of planes annually were ordered to produce thousands per month, and refineries designed for peacetime consumption were expected to fuel the largest military expedition ever mounted. The gap between ambition and capacity was staggering, and nowhere was that gap more dangerous than in diesel production. The German soldiers who fought in North Africa during 1942 and early 1943 would have been astonished to learn of this shortage. They had expected to face American forces awash in equipment, drowning in supplies, backed by an industrial base that could replace losses as quickly as they occurred. This expectation was not propaganda. It was based on hard experience. Germany had long recognized American productive capacity as a potential war winner. In the years before 1941, German military analysts had studied American industrial output. With a mixture of envy and dread, they knew that if America fully mobilized, the material balance would shift irrevocably against the Reich. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been Japan's attempt to forestall that mobilization by crippling American naval power. It had failed. And now, as Rommel's Afrika Korps retreated across Libya, as U-boats prowled the Atlantic, as the Wehrmacht prepared for another summer offensive in Russia, German intelligence reports spoke of endless American convoys, of tank divisions forming in Britain, of landing craft massing for an inevitable invasion of Europe. But what the Germans expected and what they would have experienced, had they captured American supply manifests in Tunisia, were two different things. Yes, the Americans had tanks. Yes, they had trucks and artillery and aircraft. But their logistics were strained to the breaking point. Fuel reserves in North Africa were measured in days, not weeks. Patton's armored columns advanced not in bold sweeps but in carefully rationed spurts, each movement calculated against dwindling diesel stocks. Ships loaded with fuel left American ports only to be torpedoed in the Atlantic. Those that arrived found harbors choked with vessels waiting their turn to unload. And back in the United States, refinery managers stared at production charts that would not balance, no matter how many times they recalculated. The crisis had been building for months, but it reached critical mass in the winter of 1943 for a confluence of reasons. First, the North African campaign had consumed more fuel than anticipated. The Desert War was a logistical nightmare. Every gallon of diesel had to be shipped thousands of miles, then trucked across hostile terrain where Rommel's forces interdicted supply lines. Second, the U-boat campaign had intensified. German submarines in 1942 had sunk millions of tons of Allied shipping, including dozens of tankers carrying precious fuel. Third, the build-up for the eventual invasion of Europe required stockpiling vast reserves in Britain. Every gallon sent to England was a gallon not available for the Pacific, where MacArthur's forces were island-hopping toward Japan. And fourth, the expansion of the Soviet war effort under Lend-Lease meant that America was now fueling not just its own military but significant portions of the British and Soviet forces as well. The Pentagon convened emergency meetings. Admirals and generals presented sobering assessments. Without a dramatic increase in diesel production, offensive operations in 1944 would have to be scaled back, perhaps postponed. The invasion of France, already delayed once, might be delayed again. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany, which depended on diesel-powered bombers reaching their targets, might be curtailed. And in the Pacific, the advance toward Tokyo could stall, giving Japan time to fortify its inner defensive perimeter. These were not abstract concerns. They were operational realities that could prolong the war by years, costing hundreds of thousands of additional lives. Into this crisis stepped an unlikely collection of saviors, petroleum chemists, refinery engineers, and corporate executives who had spent decades studying the molecular structure of crude oil. They worked for companies with names like Standard Oil, Texaco, and Gulf. Before the war, these companies had competed fiercely for market share. Now they collaborated under government mandate, sharing patents and research data in a common effort to solve the diesel crisis. Their weapon was not a new invention but an adaptation of existing technology, catalytic cracking. Catalytic cracking had been understood in principle for years. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. If you could not extract more diesel from crude oil through distillation, then you would break apart the larger, heavier molecules, the ones that normally became residual fuel oil or asphalt, and rearrange them into diesel molecules. This required heat, pressure, and a catalyst, a substance that accelerates chemical reactions without being consumed in the process. In theory, catalytic cracking could transform the bottom of the barrel into the middle, turning waste into war winner. In practice, it was staggeringly difficult. The chemistry involved was complex, almost alchemical in its precision. Crude oil molecules are hydrocarbons, chains and rings of carbon atoms bonded to hydrogen. The longer and more complex the chain, the heavier the molecule and the higher its boiling point. Gasoline molecules have 5 to 12 carbon atoms. Diesel molecules have 12 to 20. Residual fuel oil molecules have more than 20, sometimes 50, or more. To crack these heavy molecules, you had to break the carbon chains. But if you broke them randomly, you would get a useless mixture of gases and tars. The trick was to break them selectively, to guide the reaction so that the fragments recombined into molecules of the right size, diesel-sized. The catalyst was key. Early experiments used aluminum silicate clays, which promoted the cracking reaction at temperatures around 900 degrees Fahrenheit. But the process was inefficient and produced inconsistent results. The breakthrough came when researchers discovered that by treating the clay with acid and adding trace amounts of metals, they could create a catalyst that was both more selective and more durable. This catalyst could be recycled, passing through the reaction vessel again and again, making the process economically viable on an industrial scale. Standard Oil's Baton Rouge refinery became the testing ground for this technology. Engineers built towering reactors, massive steel columns lined with heat-resistant alloys, fed by furnaces that roared day and night. Heavy fuel oil, the sludge left over from conventional distillation, was heated and vaporized, then forced upward through a bed of powdered catalyst. As the oil vapors contacted the hot catalyst particles, the heavy molecules cracked apart. The resulting fragments, now lighter and more valuable, rose to the top of the column as diesel and gasoline vapors. The spent catalyst, coated with carbon deposits, fell to the bottom, where it was regenerated by burning off the carbon in a controlled combustion process. Then the cycle began again. It sounds straightforward in description. In execution, it was extraordinarily difficult. The temperatures had to be precise. Too low and the cracking reaction would not occur, too high and the molecules would break into useless gases. The pressure had to be controlled, too much and the equipment would rupture, too little and the vaporization would be incomplete. The catalyst flow had to be balanced, too much and the reactor would clog, too little and the reaction would stall. And all of this had to happen continuously, 24 hours a day, with crude oil flowing in and finished fuel flowing out in a delicate, synchronized dance of chemistry and engineering. The first attempts failed. Reactors overheated. Catalysts degraded faster than expected. Pipes clogged with carbon deposits. Engineers worked around the clock, adjusting temperatures, modifying catalyst formulations, redesigning reactor internals. They slept in shifts on cots in the refinery offices, ate meals brought in by local diners, and spoke in the clipped, urgent language of men who understood that soldiers were dying while they troubleshot pressure gauges and catalyst regenerators. And then, in late January 1943, it worked. The first batch of catalytically cracked diesel fuel emerged from the Baton Rouge refinery, clear, amber liquid that met military specifications. It was not much, only a few thousand barrels, but it was proof of concept. The process could work. It could be scaled up, and if it could be scaled up fast enough, it could save the war. Word spread quickly through military and industrial circles. The War Production Board allocated emergency funds. Standard Oil shared its designs with other refineries. Within months, catalytic cracking units were under construction across the United States, in Texas, California, New Jersey, Oklahoma. Each unit cost millions of dollars, a staggering sum in 1943, but the alternative was unthinkable. By summer, the new units were coming online. By autumn, American diesel production had doubled. By the end of 1943, it had tripled. The impact was immediate and profound. Fuel reserves in Britain swelled. The invasion of Sicily, launched in July 1943, was supported by ample diesel stocks. Patton's tanks swept across the island with a speed that stunned German defenders. In the Pacific, amphibious assaults that had been planned with razor-thin fuel margins now proceeded with comfortable reserves. And in the Atlantic, the tide of the U-boat war turned. With more tankers arriving safely and American production surging, the Allies could afford to route convoys more aggressively, to fuel more escort vessels, to maintain constant pressure on the German submarine fleet. The soldiers who drove those diesel-powered tanks and landing craft never knew how close they had come to sitting idle. They did not think about catalytic cracking or hydrocarbon chains or catalyst regeneration. They knew only that when they turned the ignition, the engine roared to life. They knew that when their convoy needed fuel, fuel was there. They took it for granted, as soldiers must. But behind that abundance lay a story of desperation and ingenuity, of chemists and engineers racing against time, of an industrial establishment that had teetered on the brink and then pulled itself back through sheer determination. And yet, abundance itself became a symbol. To the German soldiers captured in Tunisia and Sicily, to the Japanese defenders overrun in the Pacific, American logistical superiority was incomprehensible. They had been told that America was decadent, soft, unprepared for war. What they encountered instead was an enemy that never ran out. An enemy whose tanks always had fuel, whose trucks always had spare parts, whose artillery always had ammunition. This was not merely material superiority. It was psychological dominance. The Axis soldiers, raised in nations that preached sacrifice and discipline and the nobility of suffering, confronted an opponent for whom war seemed almost easy. Not because the fighting was less brutal, it was just as deadly, just as terrifying, but because the Americans never seemed to want for anything. In German memoirs written after the war, this theme appears again and again. A Wehrmacht officer captured in France in 1944 recalled his astonishment at the Allied supply dumps, acres of crates and barrels, food and fuel and equipment stacked higher than a man could see. We had been told that America was weak, he wrote, that they could not match our will, our discipline, our soldiers' heart. But will and discipline cannot fight what we saw. They had buried us under an avalanche of steel and petroleum. Our courage meant nothing against such abundance. This was the diesel fuel speaking, though the officer did not know it. Every tank that crushed German defenses, every truck that carried supplies to the front, every landing craft that stormed the beach, each was powered by fuel that, 2 years earlier, had not existed. Fuel that American chemists had conjured from the dregs of crude oil, from the black sludge that had once been waste. There was poetry in that transformation, a kind of industrial alchemy. The Americans had taken what was worthless and made it vital. They had looked at a problem that seemed insurmountable and solved it not through magic or miracle but through chemistry and engineering. And in doing so, they had demonstrated something fundamental about their system, their ideology, their way of war. They did not accept scarcity. They innovated past it. The Japanese soldiers in the Pacific experienced this in a different way. Japan, resource-poor and isolated, had gone to war in 1941 partly to secure access to oil and raw materials in Southeast Asia. The entire Japanese strategic calculus was built on the assumption that America, cut off from European markets and tied down in the Atlantic, could not project sufficient force into the Pacific to threaten Japan's defensive perimeter. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to buy time to fortify the island chains, time to extract resources from conquered territories, time to negotiate a peace that would leave Japan dominant in Asia. But as 1943 turned into 1944, as American forces advanced from Guadalcanal to Tarawa to Saipan, Japanese commanders realized that their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. The Americans were not overstretched. They were not faltering. If anything, they were accelerating. And the fuel that powered that acceleration, the diesel that drove the landing craft, the transport ships, the construction equipment that built airstrips on captured islands, came from refineries thousands of miles away, refineries that Japan could not bomb, could not sabotage, could not even threaten. In Tokyo, war planners studied intelligence reports and despaired. The numbers were stark. Japan produced a few million barrels of oil per year, most of it from fields in the Dutch East Indies that were vulnerable to American submarines. America produced billions of barrels. Even accounting for the Atlantic theater, even accounting for Lend-Lease shipments to Britain and Russia, the disparity was overwhelming. And now, with catalytic cracking, American refineries were extracting more fuel from every barrel of crude. The efficiency gains alone exceeded Japan's entire annual diesel production. This was not a gap that could be closed through valor or sacrifice. It was a structural imbalance, an industrial mismatch that made defeat inevitable. Japanese soldiers fought with fanatical courage on island after island, inflicting heavy casualties, dying in place rather than surrendering. But their courage could not compensate for the fuel that did not exist. Their tanks, when they had any, sat immobile for lack of diesel. Their ships remained in harbor. Their aircraft, grounded by fuel shortages, could not contest American air superiority. And so the islands fell, one by one, as American forces rolled forward on an endless tide of petroleum. Diesel fuel, in this sense, became more than a commodity. It became a symbol of American abundance, of the democratic industrial system's capacity to mobilize resources on a scale that totalitarian regimes could not match. The Axis powers had built their ideologies on notions of discipline overcoming decadence, of warrior spirit triumphing over materialism. But spirit cannot power a tank, discipline cannot fuel a ship, and by 1944, the warriors of Germany and Japan were learning that lesson in the most brutal way possible. There is a cruel irony here, one that would have been visible to observers in 1943 had they known what was happening in Baton Rouge. The very technology that was saving the Allied war effort, catalytic cracking, had been pioneered in part by a French engineer named Eugène Houdry, who had fled Europe as the Nazis rose to power. Houdry had spent the 1930s working with American oil companies to perfect the cracking process. When war came, he volunteered his knowledge and his patents to the war effort, refusing to profit from his inventions while soldiers were dying. His catalytic cracking units, built and operated by Standard Oil and other companies, transformed American fuel production at exactly the moment when the war hung in the balance. A refugee from fascism, using chemistry to defeat fascism. It is the kind of symmetry that history rarely provides. And yet, the story of diesel fuel in 1943 is not just about technology or chemistry. It is about the nature of industrial warfare and the hidden battles that determine outcomes long before armies meet on the field. World War II is remembered for D-Day and Stalingrad, for Midway and the Battle of the Bulge. These were the dramatic moments, the turning points where courage and sacrifice were on full display. But beneath those battles lay a substratum of logistical and industrial struggles, fights waged in refineries and shipyards, in laboratories and factories, by men and women whose names are forgotten but whose work was just as vital. The engineers in Baton Rouge did not storm beaches or fly combat missions. They calibrated pressure gauges. They adjusted catalyst flows. They solved differential equations and read thermocouples and tweaked reactor designs until the chemistry worked. Their battlefield was a steel labyrinth of pipes and valves, their weapon was knowledge, and their victory was measured in barrels per day. It was unglamorous work, the kind that does not inspire songs or monuments. But it was work that mattered. Without it, the ships do not sail, the tanks do not move, the war does not end in 1945 but drags on into 1946, 1947, who knows how long. By late 1944, the crisis had passed. American diesel production had surged to levels that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The refineries, now equipped with multiple catalytic cracking units, were producing fuel faster than the military could consume it. Reserves accumulated. Planners, who had once rationed every gallon, now spoke casually of surpluses. The logistical choke point had been broken, and with it, the last constraint on Allied offensive operations. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 was fueled by diesel that had not existed 2 years earlier. The armored columns that raced across France in the summer and fall, the trucks that supplied them, the landing craft that reinforced the beachheads, all ran on fuel cracked from the bottom of the barrel. When Patton's Third Army tore through the German lines and drove toward the Rhine, it did so on a river of diesel, a flood of petroleum that seemed inexhaustible because, in a sense, it was. American refineries had learned to create fuel from waste, to multiply abundance from scarcity, and that ability underpinned every subsequent Allied victory. The Germans, by contrast, were suffocating. Germany's oil supply had always been its Achilles heel. The Reich depended on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline and diesel, a process that was expensive, inefficient, and vulnerable to bombing. As the Allied strategic air campaign intensified in 1944, those plants became priority targets. One by one, they were destroyed. German fuel production, never adequate, collapsed. By the winter of 1944, panzer divisions sat immobile for lack of fuel. The Luftwaffe grounded its fighters. Even the V-2 rockets, Germany's wonder weapons, could not be launched in sufficient numbers because the mobile launchers had no diesel. The contrast was stark. On one side, abundance. On the other, depletion. On one side, tanks advancing 50 miles a day, on the other, tanks abandoned for lack of fuel. And the difference, at its root, came down to catalytic cracking. It came down to the engineers in Baton Rouge and Houston and Los Angeles who had solved a problem that nature had imposed, who had rewritten the chemistry of petroleum, who had turned waste into war winner. When the war ended in 1945, the diesel crisis of 1943 faded quickly from public memory. The soldiers came home. The factories retooled for peacetime production. The refineries kept running, now producing fuel for cars and trucks and tractors, for the highways and suburbs that would define post-war America. Catalytic cracking became standard practice, a routine part of petroleum refining, no longer miraculous but merely efficient. The technology spread worldwide. Within a decade, refineries on every continent used some variant of the process. The shortage that had once threatened to prolong the war became a historical footnote, mentioned briefly in technical histories of the petroleum industry and forgotten by everyone else. But for those who understood what had happened, the lesson was clear. Wars are won not just by soldiers but by systems. By the capacity to identify problems, to mobilize resources, to innovate under pressure, to scale solutions from laboratory to factory floor in a matter of months. The democratic industrial system, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, possessed a flexibility that totalitarian regimes could not match. It could adapt. It could improvise. It could take a chemist's idea and turn it into a strategic weapon. And there is a deeper truth here, one that resonates beyond the specifics of diesel fuel and catalytic cracking. Abundance is not just about having more. It is about the freedom to solve problems without being constrained by ideology or dogma. The American engineers who cracked the diesel crisis were not told how to think. They were not given a 5-year plan or a party directive. They were given a problem and the resources to solve it, and they were trusted to find a solution. That trust, that willingness to let smart people experiment and fail and try again, is itself a kind of abundance. An abundance of possibility. The Axis powers had brilliant scientists and engineers too. Germany pioneered jet engines and rockets. Japan built the largest battleships ever constructed. But their systems were rigid, hierarchical, intolerant of failure. Innovation was stifled by bureaucracy, by fear, by the need to conform to ideological orthodoxy. And so, when faced with problems like fuel shortages, they could not adapt quickly enough. They could not improvise. They ran out, and kept running out, until there was nothing left. America, by contrast, ran out once, in 1943, and then never ran out again. Because when the crisis hit, the system responded not with denial or repression but with urgency and creativity. The government and private industry collaborated. Patents were shared. Rivalries were set aside. And the problem was solved. This is the epilogue, the reflection that ties the story together. World War II was many things: a clash of ideologies, a struggle for survival, a tragedy of immense suffering. But it was also a test of systems, of competing models for organizing human effort and resources. And in that test, the system that allowed abundance to flourish, that trusted its engineers and chemists and factory workers to solve problems without micromanagement or terror, proved superior. Not because Americans were braver or more virtuous, but because their system was more adaptable, more resilient, more capable of turning crisis into opportunity. The diesel fuel that powered the Allied victory did not exist before the war. It had to be invented, improvised, scaled up under impossible pressure. And it was. In refineries like Baton Rouge, in laboratories and engineering offices across the country, in the unglamorous work of men whose names we do not remember, a miracle of chemistry and will occurred. They cracked the code. They broke the chains. They turned the bottom of the barrel into the fuel of freedom. And when the landing craft hit the beaches of Normandy, when the tanks rolled through France, when the war ended and the soldiers came home, they rode on diesel, diesel that had not existed when the crisis began, diesel that symbolized something larger than itself. Abundance. Ingenuity. The capacity to solve the unsolvable. That is the legacy of 1943. That is what the engineers in Baton Rouge gave the world when they made the reactors work and the fuel flowed. Not just diesel, but proof that the democratic industrial system, messy and inefficient as it often was, could marshal resources and brainpower in ways that made the impossible routine. The war was won by soldiers, but it was fueled by chemists. And the chemistry was catalytic cracking, a process that transformed waste into warfare, scarcity into abundance, crisis into victory. The Americans never ran out again, because once they learned how to crack the barrel, they never had to.